If you're interested in keeping up with the market trends of the Lorcana TCG, please consider becoming a Patreon, Twitch subscriber, YouTube channel member, or becoming a Discord server subscriber. Please also consider using my TCG Player affiliate link before you shop for cards in the description box below to help support my channel to provide you with more amazing content. Game on, everybody, and welcome to another video. So today we're going to be discussing a Lorcana in-depth deck building guide for advanced users. Let's get started. So today we're going to be discussing the following. We're going to be talking about deck size, inkable versus uninkable ratios, character actions, songs, and item ratios, un-inkable theory that I've created, and the ink curve and deck, basically what kind of playstyles they are and what that means, such as examples. So starting off, we're going to go ahead and talk about deck size. So deck size, we're going to discuss like how many cards you should put in your deck and why. So the minimum size of a deck that you can have in Lorcana is 60 and a maximum of 2 colors, unless stated otherwise in those alternative formats. So the deck size theory is because we can play a minimum of 60 cards per deck, that is technically the most consistent strategy to use. This does potentially have a drawback because when you play a consistent 60, it kind of doesn't always leave you enough space or room, so you have to make decisions and cut some things out, so it gives you less strategic options available to you. And then decks that play more than 60, so you sacrifice consistency overall, but it gives you many more tools or options to play with. So before we move on to more in-depth deck building and other things, we need to also explain what uninkables are. So how many cards that are uninkable should you fit within your deck and why? So in Lorcana, instead of using resources such as like requiring lands or getting like a mana per turn, you have cards that are inkable and uninkable. So right over here is the uninkable icon, and whereas the flourish is where a card is inkable. So uninkable cards tend to provide you more utility and tech choices and can typically be also more powerful, and the ratios may vary depending on the deck win condition. So I went ahead and I punched some numbers in to basically find out what the most optimal number is as far as consistency goes, and I went ahead and I found this. So I'm going to go ahead and step aside and show you the full slide. So right here you can see that from this graph here, I found between 9 and 13 to be the sweet spot. There are, of course, exceptions to the rule, and if you guys are interested in the full chart in full HD, you can go ahead and join my Discord. It is available there for everybody. But gonna go ahead and step aside again so you guys can go ahead and see this. So this blue curve here is the first curve, and it's basically how often you'll be seeing too many uninkables, and anything below 9 is actually super negligible. But once you start hitting 9, you get diminishing returns, and then that's the frequency of drawing, or at least seeing one uninkable for your first starting hand of 7 cards. And then the red line here is basically seeing the second one, so that's between the 9 and the 13 slot. And then once you get into the 22 slot, I believe I'm pointing to it right here, it's the red X that you can see, that actually falls into the first blue trend line. So then that basically is a much more unnoticeable like hit to your curve as far as like drawing too many uninkables for your deck. So basically the rule of thumb is like most people will try to just at most put 20 uninkables in their deck and then kind of just feel what's right. So that's not wrong, it's just that you'll probably see too many uninkables. So the rule of thumb is like if you really want to try something or test it out, or if the deck really requires it, just try not to go over 22, because then you'll for sure notice a diminishing return that's just super impactful, and it's not a great time, I'll tell you that. So up next, I'm going to go ahead and talk about specific card ratios and how many cards of a copies you should see within your deck. And this will maybe make sense to some people, but what I'm going to talk about is like, so the ratio can vary based on the card type. So not every card type will follow these specific trends, and I'll show you examples as well as we go through. So a playset is the concept of playing about 3 or 4 key cards for consistency purposes. So in Lorcana, the most cards you can play of a copy is 4. So in this example, it's 4. In some other games, it's 3. But deck ratios can change based on the card's importance and function, and then tech cards are for specific matchups or meta calls, and those ratios will also change and affect your overall like count of copies that you have available to use. So these are going to be basically charts that represent if you're going first versus second, or if you're going to be aggressively mulliganing for a specific card that you're looking for and going second. So this represents 7 cards, 8 cards, and then like 7 cards plus an aggressive mulligan and 8 cards plus an aggressive mulligan. So I'm going to go ahead and switch over to the next slide to give you a better representation of this data. So here's a line chart for each of those examples that I just went ahead and posted. So each dot represents how many cards of a copy you play within your deck. So this is 1 copy 2 3 4, and then this is copy 2 3 4 seeing within your opening hand. And then this is the same chart except if you're trying to aggressively mulligan for it. So this will be copy 1 2 3 4 and copy 2 3 4 of opening the same card within your opening hands. So at the absolute worst, if you were to play 1 copy in your deck of a card and you maybe need that specific card, you'll see it about 11 to 12% of the games that you'll be playing. And this is why it's super important to play multiple copies within a deck if it is a key card within your deck. And if you're trying to really aggressively mulligan for it, you can go ahead and try to hit about a 66.5% of the time. And then what do these numbers look like when you go second? I'll go ahead and step aside so you guys can see. So the line chart is exactly the same format. So you can see 1 copy 2 3 4 and then copy 2 3 4, and then I'll step over here so you guys can see. So at the absolute worst end, if you're trying to hard mulligan for a card, you'll see it about maybe 25% of the time if it is a one of, and then at the absolute best you'll maybe see it about 69.5% time right over here. So if you really need those key cards for a specific matchup, you can kind of plan out how likely you'll see it that specific match. And most matches are best 2 out of 3. So this is kind of a way to help you deck build and see specific cards that you're trying to see. Moving on, we're going to go ahead and talk about character cards and the ratio of character cards you should be playing. So how you can justify how many cards of a character you should be playing, you need to ask yourself these following questions, and these questions are very similar for all the other sections, so I'll fully explain this part here and then we'll reapply these to the other type of cards as we move on. So is your character card part of your win condition? You should strongly consider 4 copies. And then is the card un-inkable? You should maybe try to play 3 copies because you will consistently see it. It's just more active or live within your hand. If it isn't un-inkable, you just we'll have to see it later, and hopefully you have inkables to play up into it. Unless it's a really low card, then stuff like that matters, and I'll give more examples as well. And then does the card potentially have any technical applications? Then maybe you can play 2 copies if it is un-inkable. And one thing I like to tell myself whenever I build a deck is that, is this card even worth playing at all? And what that basically means is can I justify playing the 2 copies in my deck? Because playing one-offs is so weird and niche, and then as you saw, basically the maximum amount of times that you could even potentially see that one-off card is 25% of the time. If you hard mulligan for it or if you need it, then it's why not just play the 2 if you can fit it? So always try doing that. And then for character cards specifically, I personally like to play a 3-to-2 ratio if the card is shiftable, and I'll give you an example here. So starting off, we're going to go ahead and go through basically of those ratios. So in the aggro deck, of the Emerald and Emerald Amber deck, we have 4 copies of Kuzco typically. So he is un-inkable, but he is so vital to their game condition because of the whole 3 lore and gives them ward and has the no touchy ability. It's just super important for that deck. So even though he's un-inkable, you play 4 copies because he is the core of the strategy. And then for 3 copies, I gave an example of Rafiki. So this card is un-inkable, but it is also very good. It catches a lot of players off guard. So decks like this will be playing the Amethyst Ruby deck, where they just basically start swinging in and try to lower down those aggro boards and such and try to gain back momentum and stuff. And then for my 2 copies example, so I like to play Beast personally at 2 copies because he does have that niche application to where if my opponent is playing a very heavy item based deck, I have 2 copies. It's available for me to use. And then if my opponent is not using an item based strategy, then he's just ink. And that's okay because you need cards to be inked for the turn. And then for my 1 card copy example, this one was a little bit tough to kind of give an example for, but one thing I like to kind of showcase is I have Maui as an example. He's an 8 inkable with an I believe his stats are 8, 8, and 3. Yes, so his stats are 8, 8, and 3, and he's just a really big vanilla monster. And it's yeah, he's a big body, but what does he do? Could you play 2 of them in your deck? Maybe if it was a Maui focused deck that has an ability when you have a Maui on the board, but he doesn't do anything. And of course, I'm giving examples here and things might change in the future, but where the current meta stands for chapter 1, I'm using these as examples, and things might change, so there's my little caveat there. So to reiterate, 4 copies of Kuzco. Why? Because he's really important, even though he's uninkable. And then we have an uninkable example where you play 3 copies. It's good, but it's not like you don't want to play. You don't want to brick too hard on the uninkables. And then 2 copies of a tech card because it has applications and such. And then we have Maui as the one of. If you want like just that one big body to maybe deal with something super niche application, can you justify playing it? Probably not. And then I have an example here for shift characters. So I like the whole 3-2 ratio where we play 3 of these Aladdins and 3 of these Aladdins. And it's mix and match. It could be like 4 of these Aladdins and 2 of these Aladdins. It doesn't really matter. As long as the whole like shift ratio goes where you have 4 copies of a shiftable character. And I just use an enchanted version as like an alternative. Like maybe there's a different green shift Aladdin that's coming in the future. Maybe not. I don't know. Just as an example, that if you wanted to play like this ratio, I felt like it's very solid and it's been super successful to me. Just whenever you have 6 characters, and then you can justify fitting 4. That way you have something shiftable. There are, of course, some exceptions to this where it's like if this card can stand alone by itself, such as like the giant Tinkerbell, where you just play it and it does so much for the board. Like if a card does so much more, then you can go ahead and bump up these unshiftable ratios if it's good just playing outright. But as an example, this is what I felt is much more consistent and convenient as far as like playing the game and such. So for action cards, it's basically very similar as far as ratio goes. So it's going back to the, does this card progress your win condition or your game state? And then you might want to consider 4 copies. If it's an uninkable card, then you can do 3. If the card has technical applications, you could play 2. And then is the card worth playing at all on? Maybe you could just justify 1, but really you should try to justify a 2. So I'll go ahead and give some examples here. So we have 4 copies of Dragonfire. So Dragonfire is a fantastic card. It does so much for like the Ruby decks that it just does board removal. It does exactly what red wants to do. It's great. But I have an example here as well for like where you can play 3 copies of a card. This one was kind of hard. You can kind of swap these two, but for Fire the Cannons, it's an uninkable it's an uninkable 1 where it's in some instances it's recurable and stuff through like the Captain Hook, but because it's uninkable and it has like that 1 application, you can go ahead and maybe even recycle it. 3 feels really good. It doesn't do as much as Dragonfire does because Dragonfire can like take out that 8/8 Maui that we were talking about before, but this one just has like a slightly lesser like impact to the game, whereas Dragonfire is just part of the whole deck core. And then for 2, I have Freeze as an example. Finding 2 and 1 of examples were a little bit more difficult because I was trying to keep to just the action cards without like that are songs. But I'll talk about those, of course, soon. But as far as like action goes, like this is like a tech card for all intents and purposes. Like you play this, it immediately exerts one of your opponent's characters, and then you can go ahead and challenge it. And then for the 1 of copies, this is probably not the greatest example, but it's also like it could come up. It's like, oh, where's Fire the Cannons? This one requires like a character to already be damaged in order to use it. So it could come up, but there's better cards. So there's that. All right, so we're going to go ahead and move to song cards that are actions. So very similar. We're going to go ahead and just briefly talk about the different plot points that I already talked about. So again, it doesn't progress your win condition. 4, uninkable, maybe 3. Technical application, try to play 2, and then 1 copy. Can you really justify it? Maybe can you play 2 copies? So these cards are often required for unique ratios to enable combos and such that overall give you better consistency. So we're going to go ahead and go through some examples now. So I have Friends on the Other Side. Need I say more? This card is the best song in the game. It can be played for free to draw you 2 cards. Fantastic. And then this one, I was torn between showing this card and Part of Your World as a 3 of copy, but I strongly think that like a card like Be Prepared is a 3 of. Just because like 1, it's uninkable, so like you don't want to try to play 2 more. If it's core to your strategy, sure, you can play 4, but just like this and Part of Your World, I think there's times where you don't even need it. If you're already so far in advance in the game, It's just mostly like a follow-up kind of card if you're falling behind. So like, if you're a decent player, I don't think you need the 4 copies. You can probably just get away with 3. So that's my example of 3. And then for 2 copies, I have Part of Your World. This is really a tech card that recycles something from your banished pile back to your hand, and allows you to maybe do some kind of combo. But there's a Hades that does exactly what this card does. So you can justify maybe playing 2 of these. And then for my one-off copy, I have, again, this wasn't like, maybe in the future this card could be better, but like playing Hakuna Matata as like a one-off copy for that niche healing situation, sure, that's cool. We'll see if that ever comes up. So now we're going to talk about item cards, and this is actually where it changes. So basically, does this card result in your win condition? Consider playing 3 or 4 copies. I personally found like the maximum amount of copies of an item is like 3. And then, so does this card, is it uninkable? Then maybe you consider playing 2. And then does it have any technical applications? You can maybe play 1, maybe 2. And then, is it even worth playing at all? Can you justify playing that 1 copy? It's nice to play the 2, but like in some instances, you can try to play the 1 as a tech for maybe some specific matchup. If it's inkable, then sure, throw it in there. And worst case scenario, it's ink. You know what I mean? So item cards are basically for resource generation and board control. So I'm going to go ahead and go show some examples here. So 4 copies, like, again, this one maybe isn't necessary for like 4 copies, because like this is only like super relevant for like the ramp decks, the Sapphire ramp style decks. So I put 4 as the example here. Maybe you could play 3, but this one is an inkable card that turns any of your cards for turn as ink. And if you're trying to go ahead and do that, cool. And then as my example of 3 copies, like, so in one of my other deck lists that I'll be showcasing soon, is that this card is a 3 of copy, just because it's so good. It does exactly what the strategy wants as far as like aggressive decks go. And then like the 2 of copies, so I have Ursula's Cauldron as like one of those, you know, either it's a card for consistency purposes, but it's not vital to the core strategy. It just kind of helps you filter out through some cards. And then like the 1 of copy, I put this as like a tech example. So this card technically isn't that great as of right now, but it could come up. Just like I wanted to also put Poison Apple in case we ever get into a princess meta. But like if we are playing in a meta where you have this 1 of copy, it's kind of nice just to have it. I wish this was like an inkable version of it. And then of course the meta could shift where we see much more villain decks or princess decks, and then we would basically bump up these. But then again, it's like, do you want to fit this 1 of that's uninkable in your deck? Can you justify the space for it? It's a tech card, right? So maybe there's cards in the future where you can purposely discard a card from your hand to gain an advantage, and then that would be cool. But those are my item examples and ratios and such. So moving on, we're going to go ahead and talk about playing too many uninkables. So I do want to say that if you're playing above the 9 to 12 range that I've already discussed, basically the reason why you would be doing that is maybe a strategy requires that many uninkables, like more uninkables. And to note that control cards are usually uninkable as well. So how I've been able to increase the consistency while playing more uninkable cards, I try to do like a balancing of trying to play more draw or filter cards that help me get card advantage, because in this game card advantage is really strong and super vital for the strategies. You see more cards, you play more cards, and you more are in favor to win. So I like to do a 3-to-1 ratio. So for every uninkable card, I try to balance it out with 3 draw or filter cards to try to maintain the consistency. And if your deck can reliably draw cards, the amount of uninkables is much more forgiving. So we're going to go ahead and talk about ink and curve now. So basically what we're going to elaborate on and showcase are different type of play styles. So if a deck is much more aggressive, they'll have usually a lower curve, whereas you play a more control deck, they'll have a higher curve. And the range is typically anything that a deck that really needs to get going is 2 or less ink for those aggro style decks. Mid-range kind of decks are between the 3 and 4 inks. Like that's where the most of their like played cards will be, like where they get their most value is at that range. And then the control decks are at the very late game, or like in 5+ ink per turn. And then from there, we are going to go ahead and showcase some examples here. So we now have different playstyle decks. This one is an aggressive or aggro style deck where we have Emerald and Amber. So as you can see here, the curve is actually very, very low. It plays most of its cards at the lower end and such. And we have basically, step right over here, include a number of low cost characters and action songs and items that can help you play the first and few actions of the game that yield high lore values per turn. These cards help you establish an early board presence and exert pressure on your opponent. That's the whole play style of aggro. You basically flood the board with really low cost characters and try to gain advantage really early on before your opponent can set up. And then up next, I want to showcase to you guys an example of a mid-range deck. This one technically leans much more aggro, but this is my personal, well, all of these are my personal versions of the deck, but this is my my Amber Steel deck that I've been really enjoying. And so this curve technically is much more on the earlier end, but its key cards are basically more towards the middle of the cards. So what this is, I'm going to go ahead and step actually to the side. So this is typically the most critical part of the curve, the 3-4 parts of it. So these cards often represent a core to your deck and should have really strong impact on the mid game when played. So this kind of is in between. This will, like in this build in particular, has much more impact on like the very aggressive style decks and has a opportunity to play against the control style decks because it does have some control elements to it. And again, it's just kind of really condensed here. The key cards are here, but this one does lean a little bit more aggro style. But in comparison to the previous list, this one is much more aggressive early and then has most of its mid-game stuff present here for specific matchups. And then I wanted to add another deck here. So this one is my mid-range leaning more towards control. This is the Sapphire Steel deck. So a lot of players really enjoy this deck as well. So this one is more towards the end of the curve, and basically, just as stated before, I felt like if I didn't include a deck of every color, some people would be kind of upset that I didn't include one. So here is my mid-range, leaning more towards control Sapphire Steel deck. So you guys can go and check that out. And again, these lists are all available on my Discord, so feel free to join, and you guys can have access to those lists as well. And then we're going to go ahead and show you guys a high curve deck. In this case, it is the big bad of the chapter 1. So this is an example of my control deck that I have for my Ruby Amethyst. So right over here, you guys can go ahead and see that it does have like a decent start in the beginning, but this is the only deck that has those curves at the towards of the late end game, where it's just like these cards demand an answer and action and such. Just the whole like it's just the dominating deck currently of the format. I also still personally think Amber Steel is the best deck, but that is just my opinion. So anyways, so while you don't want high cost cards in your deck though to be too overloaded, and you basically won't have any kind of ability to play the early game, these cards are very essential to have like the higher end stuff that can help you close out the game and really draw out the game, so your opponent really can't, like, they demand an answer. They kind of wasted all of their gas early game, and now you're just kind of in it for the long ride, and you'll just close them out. So like in the early aggressive decks, you're just questing for lore super fast. In the mid game, you're kind of just like playing to your opponent, giving them answers and stuff, basically following up after they make certain plays. And then like the control decks are basically like, yeah, you can go ahead and go as fast as you want, but if you can't beat me in the early game, I'm gonna win because I just have too many answers that need, or too many cards that require answers from your end. So I wanted to go ahead and bring out these things because, like, is this gospel? No, it's just basically you guys really should just consider the following anytime you try to build a deck. So you should always keep in mind what the current metagame is and see what the trends are to kind of configure your deck for certain ratios and such, and figure out what like important tech cards and choices that you should try to put within your deck, and adapt ratios also based on your locals, because whenever you go try to play at like a big top tier tournament of whatever capacity, your locals is going to be very different from like not to say that it's like tabletop like games and such, but like at a local end it's much different from the like super competitive pro end. So you always have to keep in mind, like, build decks to the strength of what's around you, And then always be sure to test, tweak, and refine your build. Come up with the core. Try to use my ratio examples to like work on a deck. And then if you feel like something needs to be bumped up, that's fine. You know, you tested it, you're refining the deck, and you're going to go ahead and keep tweaking it as you go, and then you're going to find the perfect deck to build. So I really hope this was very helpful to newer players and more advanced players, and let me know what you guys think in the comment section down below. Join my Discord. We have a great community there, and if you guys want access to my market watch sheets, please consider subscribing via Twitch, Discord, Patreon, and on my YouTube memberships. Also check me out on Twitter if you guys are interested in cool little infographics that I've been posting out ever since, like, I don't know, a month before the first chapter came out. So yeah, I hope this was very insightful for you guys. I'll see you in the next video. I'm out of here.